Welcome to the Industry Experts Panel at PortfolioWealthGlobal.com. My name is Michelle Holliday. Today, we are welcoming back to the show Mr. Charles Hugh Smith. Charles is an economic expert. He is the author of numerous best-selling books covering our economy and our society, including the book entitled Why Our Status Quo Failed. His work is published on the financial websites, including Zero Hedge, Peak Prosperity, and the Kaiser Report. He is the man behind of2minds.com. And we're calling on Charles today as our first guest following Tuesday's November 3rd, 2020 elections. Today, as we are taping, it is now Thursday, November 5th, and we still do not have an official call as to the winner of the presidential elections inside the United States. What we do have, however, is a very strange situation and a whole lot of questions to cover. Charles, welcome back to the show. How are you today?
Good. It's always a pleasure to have a conversation with you, Michelle. Your questions are always right on topic.
We knew exactly who we were going to call right after the elections, and we thought we would know who the winner was, to be honest. We knew that there was going to be some delay back and forth, but we really didn't anticipate what actually happened, Charles. To be frank, I guess this was not unexpected because there's been a lot of talk and discussion in the past couple of months about voter fraud and everything being very prevalent. The mainstream media was calling for a blue wave, which of course did not happen, but the counting actually stopped on Tuesday night. And that's where I want to start our conversation, Charles. No explanation was given. What are your thoughts on why the counting was stopped late Tuesday night?
Well, of course, a lot of us are wondering, how prevalent the election issues are in terms of whether things are being counted, not counted, and how and why, right? And so I guess my context is I see this as part of the social disorder that we've been witnessing over the last, I don't know, however many years you want to say, at least the last 4. And the polarization of the American public into these really kind of hardened camps where there's almost no middle ground. And each camp is absolutely convinced that they're correct and that the future of the country rests on them winning. And so that kind of disorder and hardening of positions is very sobering, because it's really hard to see how the country can work its way out of this, regardless of what happens in the election. And so in my point here is the election controversies seem to be part of a larger movement toward polarization and social disorder, and that's what's worrisome.
The president gave a statement late Tuesday night questioning why certain states that he had won with numbers too high for candidate Biden to catch up to had not already been called. Those included Michigan, Georgia, and North Carolina. He compared the fact that Arizona had already been called very early in the evening at only 63%. And you just touched on this. It seems to be a bigger picture that he's dealing with. Obviously, he's gone through his first term with nonstop attacks, and yet he's done an amazing job. But going back to Tuesday night, it seemed to be almost, Charles, pre-coordinated in a way, because all those states stopped their counting at the exact same moment. And you have to sort of absorb the fact that everyone is very focused upon voting and counting, because within the Constitution, it's within the Constitution that a presidential election needs to be called, the voting needs to be counted, all votes need to be in by midnight of that voting day. So this is a very interesting situation, this mail-in voting and how many days past the voting day certain states are allowed to count their votes and so on and so forth. I think in North Carolina, they were given 9 days past or something. They're sort of throwing out the Constitution, which brings into question if the president, which he will, of course, goes forward and contests this and takes it to the Supreme Court. Where do we go from there? What's your projection?
Well, that's a great question, and I don't claim any expertise in constitutional law, of course. And we know from the contested election in 2000, right, where it came down to the Florida vote and hanging chads and a lot of controversy over whether ballots were invalid because of voter, not working the machines correctly or some
all kinds
flaw
of things,
in
right?
the ballots.
Yeah. You used the wrong color pen.
And right. So, right. And so I think just to kind of provide a little context, 4 years ago, there was a lot of concern that voting machines, which as we know, were moving to the electronic variety as opposed to a punch card, that there was potential for fraud in voting machines, right? Because there was no paper trail that could be audited. And so one of the thoughts I've had about this contested election going forward is, well, if people did mail in their ballots, at least there's a paper trail. In other words, there is a paper ballot, there's a signature there, and various information, right? That can be confirmed. And so And one thought I had was, well, at least we're in better shape for a valid recount because we have a paper ballot and we have a paper trail that can be audited. Where the electronic machines that people were questioning 4 years ago, it was like there was no audit trail. And so if the machine had been gamed or hacked or something like that, then there was a recount was essentially invalid. So I think that's a positive thing. The other thing is, of course, with the pandemic and the mail-in ballots, as you say, the Constitution didn't specify mail-in ballots, which didn't exist in 1789. But for me, the issue is, can it be audited where everybody involved can trust the audit or the recount? And I think that's a ray of hope in this because there at least we have a paper trail.
Right, right. And all we're really looking for is the truth, that's really all that counts, no matter if it's candidate Biden, if it's President Trump. We're all Americans. We respect who is voted every 4 years into that seat. And so this is just a very odd thing. And the people that I have talked to, and I've gone around and talked to a few people, no one has ever heard of the counts actually stopping on Tuesday night. It's just unheard of. And it's a very this is where everybody gives pause because, it looks like the president was about to win when the voting stopped until the numbers could be calculated, the electoral votes could be calculated to determine how many more Biden needed to be added to win. That's the way it appears. And it looks, that's just the way it appears. I hope that's not what happened. But what else could have been the reason for all of those states just stopping? It was shortly after midnight. I mean, it wasn't like, oh, we're tired, we're going home. Everybody right now, everyone's going home at 12:21 in the morning. This is a very odd situation. This is what I want to explore this a little bit. What else could have been the reason, Charles, for all of this just to stop counting? Have you ever experienced that or known about that?
No, and I don't claim any expertise on the process of elections, which, of course, as we know in the United States, are local. In other words, each county has its own mechanism and its own staffing and so on. And so to me, I'm kind of trying to look at it from 30,000 feet and seeking some sort of historical context. Like, has something like this happened in the U.S. before? And of course, there were contested elections in 1876, which have received a lot of commentary recently. And so, and a lot of people have explored like exactly what options does the Constitution provide for a contested election. And of course, if there is no electoral college count that's a winning total, then of course it goes to a congressional mechanism to choose the president, right? So that's also a possibility. And so I guess to answer your question, I think what I'm seeing is kind of just trying to be an impartial observer is, a lot of people are losing trust and faith in our institutions. And so this kind of question that you're raising, it's been part of a long, like at least a multi-year kind of questioning of the legitimacy of some of these institutions we've counted on. And that includes, of course, the media. And for a lot of people, it also includes the FBI and the CIA and some of the security agencies, because this whole Russiagate thing, however you identify, whether you're a partisan or whether you're an independent voter, it's now becoming clear that Russiagate was basically a fabrication, right? That the Steele dossier and all this stuff was basically fabricated out of thin air for other purposes. So, and it's your question about the election calls to mind. A lot of us are wondering, like, how come the Department of Justice hasn't been able to indict anybody for the Russiagate fraud? And so this is another mystery. and so as we don't seem to be getting clear answers, then people are losing faith and trust in these institutions that we all rely on. And so that's also worrisome. Like, how do we reestablish the public faith? And of course, the more polarized our population becomes, then the more difficult it is to find that trust. And so I don't have an answer for you about the election process, and I also don't know about how the screening is going to validate mail-in ballots and provisional ballots and so on. And so I'm anticipating that all this will have to be redone under another level of scrutiny. But I don't know, as I said, that how the Constitution actually defines that or case law. And so we really could be in new territory in terms of recounting entire states of millions of ballots.
Wow. That is just such an extraordinary take, and it's probably the most fair, really. I mean, to have had the count stopped on Tuesday night just brings up so many red flags, because it's an unheard of thing, because all five of the what they call the swing states stopped at the exact same moment in time, which is just, unfathomable that they weren't pre-coordinated in some way to, get the signal to stop. And again, it appears that they were stopped in order to, because the numbers were looking like the president was going to win, and they needed to find out the numbers they needed to calculate in order to determine what it would take for Biden to win. That's the way it looks, because there's really no other explanation. Without another valid explanation, we are lost in that zone of, is this complete fraud? Secondly, we had a lot of very angry poll watchers in those states who were not allowed to access their job, Charles. And a poll watcher's job is actually to watch the envelopes be opened and have each vote be tabulated, just to ensure the fairness of the process. It's a very important position, actually, and it's the first time poll watchers have reported to have been actually blocked and kept out. So a lot of this is adding up to a very shocking situation, and it's against a president Charles, that was an outsider, that took office, that recaptured our wealth, rebuilt our country against the odds, as you mentioned, of the mainstream media and most of Washington constantly attacking him through fabrications. And we don't even need to go into it. You know, it was Russia, and then it was impeachment, and then all of a sudden this mysterious virus hit out of the blue. So now we have the rest of the world watching, sort of in distress. There's so many people saying, how could a president who's done that for America even be challenged by a candidate who was in office for 47 years and under whose influence most of our jobs were sent overseas, and most of our people, we've discussed many times before the disparity between the rich and the poor and how wide that was becoming over the past decades of rule, and that was actually coming together, Charles. So people are wondering how Americans could do this. Mr. Biden doesn't know his name many times. Mr. Biden is calling for a 60% tax rate for wealthy people. 47 years, you know what I mean? And what could he possibly bring back now that could benefit the country, and how could this happen? That's the perspective from overseas, I think. And I want to talk about how the world is going to see this.
Well, that's a great topic, Michelle. And of course, those of us who try to follow foreign news, there's not a lot of non-U.S. Media coverage available in the U.S. You pretty much have to subscribe to, say, a paper in Britain, you know, like The Guardian or The Independent, or you get a translation of a French or German, paper. And so I guess my point is, it's difficult for us to really get a good assessment of how the world is responding to this. But there's certainly, as you say, distress or dismay that the world's oldest democracy, continuous democracy, is struggling with these very basic mechanisms. And of course, it's almost humiliating, if you will, because say former President Carter, for example, he worked very hard over the decades, going and trying to make sure that elections in smaller countries that were newer democracies were fair. And so the fact that we, have these questions about the legitimacy of our voting process is kind of a humiliation. But again, on the brighter side, if this all comes into the open, where our courts are allowed to work, right, and that if the courts mandate a recount in certain, counties, that would be done with some sort of oversight. So I think the U.S. does have mechanisms to deal with this. And so we have to, as difficult as it may be, we have to sort of trust that that there are mechanisms that can follow through with an audit or a recount as mandated by the court system, right? And of course, there's another element of distrust or concern here, is that the Democratic Party has viewed the Supreme Court as possibly imbalanced and has lost its objectivity, and so that if it does go to the Supreme Court, there'll be questions about that, because. And that's not also unusual in American history, right? That lots of presidents have been accused of loading the Supreme Court and that kind of thing. So these are issues that go back literally to the founding of the Republic.
Right. This is just such a fascinating situation. Really, everything that we've discussed right now, and many Americans. Not necessarily our audience, of course, but many Americans appear to be stupid or ignorant to other portions of the world because they don't realize things. But the truth is, they're not stupid and they're not ignorant. Many Americans are simply not aware. And because they're not aware, because our mainstream media is mostly propaganda right now, and they still haven't come out of the mindset that, Walter Cronkite is behind all of our journalism, which, left the building quite a while back, because of the censorship, of our doctors and our scholars and our independent journalists. Many of our Americans remain unaware. And also, the goal of censorship is to keep Americans unaware. But when you control the information, of course, you control the population. And what I'm going for here is the fact that we have a constitution in this country that desperately needs protected. Our First Amendment, there's a reason that our First Amendment is freedom of speech. And that's to make sure our government doesn't have control of the information that Americans or anyone else within a certain country is allowed to hear. What's your perspective on the censorship that led up to the election this year?
Well, that's a terrific topic, Michelle. And I have some actual personal experience of being shadow banned, is what they call it, when the big tech platforms like Facebook and Google and Twitter just get rid of your priority in their search terms, and they just delete your tweets and your posts, and in terms of Google, send you to search Siberia, right, where no one can find your site. They didn't block you, obviously, right, where that could be tracked. They just delete you from their search priority, if you will. And so I was shadow banned in 2016 because I had posted some things questioning certain aspects of Hillary Clinton's campaign. And I was accused of being a Russian, front person or something like that, along with several hundred other completely legitimate alternative media sites. And so I think one of the things that really worries a lot of us in the alternative or independent media is that 10 years ago, or certainly at least 15 years ago, when the internet was first exploding, it was all about what we call protocols, meaning that there was, you could set up a website and you could have email and that kind of thing. What's happened now is the growth of these big tech monopolies is they have imposed the platform. Now corporations control most of what people think of as the internet. Everybody goes to Google for their search, and everyone goes to Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and so on. And so that's been a tremendous change, where it used to be sort of like the Wild West, and where the internet was much freer because there was no real control. Now these big tech platforms control a majority of the traffic. And so they get to impose their own kind of censorship, if you will. And it's all what we call black box, meaning that it's not like there's an agency that we can ask for transcripts on. There's no transparency in what these big tech platforms are doing. It's all hidden inside their corporate headquarters and inside their algorithms. So that's extremely worrisome. And that's why a lot of us were very pleased to see the Department of Justice pursue antitrust actions against Google recently. And so I guess my point here is, not only is there the potential for government restrictions to access of information, there's also corporations who now gather such immense control that, especially in social media, and that that's a problem. And of course, we've you and I have discussed in the past how even conventional, traditional media has been concentrated in the hands of literally 6 companies, right? Disney and Viacom, et cetera, et cetera. And now we see like Jeff Bezos with Amazon buying the Washington Post, which published the proper not list that got me shadow banned. So, it's extremely worrisome, because once people start getting these fortunes of like 30, 40 billion, 50 billion, 100 billion, well, then they can just start buying up the levers of control of free speech. And that's what we're seeing. And that's really worrisome.
It's so huge. It's huge. Most people don't realize that until the Clinton administration, the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, had very strict laws about who could own media companies and how many media companies they could own, one type. In some places, if it was a very small population, one company could not own both, the newspaper and then go and buy a television station because it's antitrust. There would be no monopoly upon information, television station. Mostly it rules newspapers, television stations, and radio stations. Bill Clinton took that out under his administration. He allowed the FCC to remove those protections for the American people. And I honestly, Charles, I think it's one of the worst things that's ever happened to our country. I really, if I had to pick something that I knew of, if I knew of everything, I really believe that would be the number one worst thing, aside, of course, from probably taking our money off the gold standard. But when you want to talk about a presidential action, because what he did was now he allows people like Bezos literally to, and most people are starting to realize that it's the pharmaceutical companies. These 6 companies that own everything also own the pharmaceutical companies. And the whole point was you couldn't own a television station and a pharmaceutical company because what are you going to do? You're going to advertise your product on the television station and you're going to make sure that everybody sees your product as being good. It's just, the protections of our country are just going out the window. And, you mentioned a term to me we talked about, which was pretty extensive. And it was, I think it was globalist polarization, where it's the globalist agenda coming in. Is this part of that, do you think?
Well, that's a great topic. And of course, again, this is a very polarizing issue that one camp says, well, globalization is good for the world. It's competition and, it's good for consumers because all these goods and services are cheaper because of global competition. And the other camp is saying, yeah, but what was the cost to the domestic U.S. economy in terms of loss of jobs, loss of control of production and so on. And so I think it's one of those situations where there's valid points on both sides, but the question is everything that's going on transparent and is there really competition? Because that's really the core of free enterprise is that everything is transparent. Like everybody knows what's on the market and the information is available to everybody. And you make your best decision in your own best interests, and there's competition, right? And so when there's no competition, or it's been controlled by a cartel, there's 5 or 6 companies that control everything and collude, then you get into the problems we're talking about. And so I think to your point, we're seeing this erosion of transparency and competition in industry after industry, and it goes back at least 20 years. In other words, through administrations, Republican and Democratic. Unfortunately, it seems to be a much longer trend. So you mentioned pharmaceuticals. A lot of people are recalling, if you're of a certain age, you can remember when pharmaceutical companies were not allowed to advertise in magazines and on TV. They were not allowed to advertise directly to consumers. They could only advertise to physicians in physicians' publications. And so now we see the domination of many media platforms by big pharma ads, right? Pushing drugs and medications which may not be as effective as they're presented, or they may be addictive, or, all this stuff comes out after people have suffered, terrible consequences of using these medications while they were promised that they were safe. And so we see you mentioned another thing that happened in the Clinton administration was the division, the regulatory line between commercial banking and investment banking that was that was part of the regulatory sort of response to the Great Depression, right, was to create a barrier between investment banking, which is very speculative, and regular commercial banking. Well, that line got dissolved, right? And so then, like, night follows day. Within a few years, we had the great global financial meltdown, right? Because the banks and the financial sector were allowed to speculate wildly and crazy and without proper oversight. And so there you go, another example of what you're talking about. Now we have 5 too big to fail banks. We have, 5 corporations that control the media, 5 big pharma companies, and so on. And this is really destructive to the, I think, the American economy, because you get rid of transparency and competition, you no longer have a free market, right? And what we're talking about is the free flow of information, freedom of speech. That's also being limited, just like everything else. And so we're at it feels like we're at a tipping point as a nation, and I think a lot of people feel that, and that's partly why people are so anxious and polarized. Is they're really concerned. For good reason.
Right, a tipping point. That's a really interesting point, that pharmaceutical companies were not allowed to actually advertise and they could only go to the doctors. It's the way it should be. The doctors need to determine what the person needs, because at the end of these commercials you hear, ask your physician about this. You know what I mean? Go to your physician and find, and see if he knows, and if he doesn't know, tell him. Come on. Wow, that's a really interesting point. This is just so disturbing to watch. You made so many great points about the whole picture. In closing, I'd like you to just give your prediction. What's your gut instinct on what's going to happen with the presidential election and over the next 2 to 4 years, economically and for the world, and mostly for the United States, though? What does Charles Hugh Smith think?
Well, one thing I think is, regardless of who wins the presidency, one of my main concerns is the Federal Reserve, which is basically like a Politburo. It's like a totalitarian institution. It's run by a handful of people behind closed doors, and it controls our money. And the president really doesn't have control of our money, and neither does Congress, right? That's been ceded. That power has been ceded to the Federal Reserve. And so if the Federal Reserve pursues like an inflationary policy that destroys the purchasing power of our money, then everybody that's earning wages is going to lose ground. And the elected government doesn't seem to have any power to control this. And so I'm concerned about that the financial sector, or whatever you want to call the Federal Reserve and the banks and all that, could eat away at our money and impoverish all of us slowly. And the elected government would basically be standing by, wringing its hands. And so that's one issue that I would predict will come to a head. There's got to be either control of the Fed, or the Fed's going to maybe bring the nation to its knees, through inflation.
Through inflation. Paint that picture for us. What
well,
are we
real
up
quick.
against here?
Well, real quickly, all these things we've talked about, globalization and financialization, and other things. Wages have gone nowhere for 40 years. So they've stagnated. Most people, the bottom 90%, aren't making any more money if you measure what your money can buy, right? In terms of how much housing and childcare and food and healthcare you can buy with your wages. So that means that most people can't survive high inflation. And so if the Fed's going to print trillions of dollars and give it to the big banks and the corporations and the financiers, eventually this is going to cause high inflation. And that's going to bring the regular people to the point where they can't afford to live. And this will create social disorder that will make today's situation look like a summer picnic. And that's my concern. And so I think, how do you control inflation? Well, you've got to stop printing trillions of dollars and giving it to the bankers and financiers. And so, the Fed may choose to print trillions and give it to households. and that, universal basic income and this kind of thing. And that will look like a solution at first, but then that will also fire up inflation. And so my concern is that we could be taken down, not politically, but financially, because once people can't afford to survive and live, then they're going to become, the social disorders really going to take off.
So you don't think the risk or the threat, I guess I should say, is nearly, as bad from the political standpoint as it is from the central bank standpoint? You think the real threat is the central banks, as it has been, and going forward, it will continue to be?
Yeah, I tend to think that's my forecast. Is I think the nation is going to face like something on the equivalent of the Great Depression. Now, whether it's a hyperinflationary, collapse like Venezuela, or it's just an erosion of purchasing power where people, no longer have the means to support their families and their lifestyle, then I think that's going to trigger a political crisis. But it won't be, Republican or Democrat so much. It will be who controls the nation's money and financial, assets. And right now, it's a relatively small handful of folks. And so the rest of us are really just kind of powerless observers, And so I think the elected representatives of the government are going to have to take back control of the money supply. And, this was the way that the Constitution originally was laid out. The Treasury, which is controlled by the elected government, controls the nation's money supply and its banking. And so maybe we need to go back to that, where the elected officials actually control the money supply and the financial sector through the United States Treasury. So that's one thing that I think really is worrisome. And it ties into everything we've been talking about in terms of globalization and political turmoil and social disorder or conflict, right? Because as each of us feels crunched by inflation, that the purchasing power of our money is declining, then we become more anxious and we become more prone to maybe polarization, right? Like that we start seeking some sort of scapegoats for the fact that our economy is not working for everybody anymore.
Right. And the anger goes up. Who do you think would be best equipped to deal with that? Mr. Biden or Mr. Trump?
Well, then you get into the whole idea of the whole question of how profound are the forces that have been working to disempower President Trump over the last 4 years. And I don't have any expertise or insight into that other than to say that when it reaches down to little old bloggers like me, it's obviously fairly profound. I don't know, honestly, the health of Mr. Biden is a question mark that a lot of people have, and so people are already talking about the potential of that president if he does win the election, despite all the court machinations that are going to be happening. Whether he would last in office for the whole 4 years. So there's just a huge number of variables here in this equation, and I honestly can't really say. I again go back to my foundation, which is we've got to make the economy work for everybody, and if we can't do that, then we're really going to come apart at the seams, because the economy's got to be able to work for everybody, not just for the few at the expense of the many. And that's the way it is right now.
Right. And if we see a Mr. Biden win, we're going to have a Kamala Harris president. I mean, it's fairly obvious. This gentleman is not. I've watched video of how he used to be. He's not the same. He doesn't. Honestly, Charles, half the time he doesn't remember his name. I've seen they've showed a couple of them, over and over, these one or two. I've seen 7 times, different times, where he can't remember his name. That's not just I'm confused about what location I'm in because I'm traveling so much. That is something's wrong, something's up. And to put the hands of our country into this person and have him negotiate on our behalf with the rest of the world, the Putins and the Chinas and, the Japans and the Saudi Arabias and everyone. Or your alternative is to put it in the hands of Miss Harris. How would she be in negotiating for this is just, it's just, you know what, I'm going to leave it to say, the president is a fighter. The Supreme Court is very fair. There's something very strange that the vote stopped and the poll watchers were not allowed in. There's some very strange variables here. So we're just going to have faith and see how it turns out. And whoever wins, wins, right?
Yeah, I think almost there has to be some faith in the destiny of the United States because I'll give you, I know we're running up against time limits, but,
please continue. We want to hear everything you have to say. I love my guests to expound.
Well, just one example of how crazy things can get was, Woodrow Wilson was president during the World War I era, and he suffered a stroke and was basically bedridden for something like 9 months. And essentially, his wife was the sitting president because people would say, well, here's what we need a decision on. And then she would go into the president's room and lock the door. And then she would come out and tell him what the president said. So, and this went on for months at a very critical time in American history. So I guess I just wanted to bring that up. And there's a book about it written, I think, in the 60s called When the Cheering Stopped, if you wanted to read more about this. And it just goes to show that there's a lot of peculiarities and strangeness in American history, and we seem to be entering one of those periods. And so I think we're just going to have to kind of keep, to use one of your words, keep our balance and keep our perspective that we're all Americans, right? And that we've weathered a lot of crises. And so we're just going to have to try to maintain our composure here and not seek scapegoats, right? And I think if we do that, then we're going to get through this. And I'm not sure how exactly, but yeah, we'll get through it.
Yes, we will. And we're all Americans. We are the American family. You know what I mean? For the rest of the world. We cannot fight amongst ourselves. We need to come together, and I think everything will work out the way it's supposed to work out. It's always amazing to have you here. Please go ahead and tell everybody a little bit about your books and also how to follow your work.
Oh, thank you very much. Well, visit me at of2minds.com. All my archives are free. I have samples of my books that you can read the first couple chapters. And what I write about is the potential for a really positive change in our economy. And by that, if you change the economy, then you change society and the political structure too. So I see it as a potential, opportunity in the next, say, 5 to 10 years to make things better for people, giving them more power, more access to capital, and a more resilient America. So that's what I write about.
Right. And hopefully everyone will, start to wake up, start to really investigate what's going on and how we're going to protect our country and protect our Constitution. That means everyone's going to have a refreshed love of our country and our Constitution, who we really are, right?
Well said. That's a great summary right there.
Yes. Charles, you'll come back soon, right? Because we want to once we get this all figured out, I want to get your perspective then in hindsight of what just happened.
Well, I'd love to come back on, and we're in for some very interesting times, so there'll be lots to talk about.
We sure are. It's going to be great. Thank you so much for coming on this show today.
Thank you so much, Michelle. It was a great pleasure.
Yes, indeed. Mr. Charles Hugh Smith, economic expert, commentator, author, and the man behind of2minds.com. For the Industry Experts Panel, I'm Michelle Holliday at portfoliowealthglobal.com.